Chapter 9. The borrowed skiff still bobbed in the surf below the rope ladder. The protagonist lowered himself back down from the barge's deck. During his absence, a few inches of frigid water had splashed into the boat, and he found himself having to brace his feet up on the transom to avoid getting soaked. Using one of the oars, he pushed off from the massive hull and began floating away. As he traveled farther and farther from the barge, it receded into the distance and appeared to shrink smaller and smaller. But perhaps the barge remained unchanged, and it was really the protagonist himself that was getting smaller and smaller, and lonelier as he rushed away from the lights and the assistance of the Aerolim. He aimed the boat for the lights emanating from the shore where he had launched himself. For a moment, he thought he could hear an oboe droning an A note coming from the direction he was headed. He rowed faster, hoping to get close enough to tune himself to whomever was waiting for him on the beach. But even after several minutes of rowing, the lights on the shore seemed to be growing smaller and smaller as well. He was caught in the outgoing tide rushing from the bay to the deep sea. He beat on against the current, but was borne ceaselessly away from his destination. No matter how hard he tried, the water dragged him away faster than he could row. As the distance between himself and the shore inexorably increased, the protagonist conceded that it was now something forever unreachable in his past. Even the blue smudge the Aerolim had left on his sleeve had faded away. He could no more return to the barge or the shore than he could return to the events that happened earlier in the evening at the bar or the church or the library. His future wasn't measured in a tick on the clock, but in his inevitable velocity in the direction of the skiff's bow. An icy fog started to roll in, and one by one the lights of the city shoreline dimmed and faded away. In turn, even the large barge and its bright spotlights slowly vanished from view completely, as they too became obscured in the mist. No longer having an obvious reference point to navigate from, the protagonist became a bit disoriented and unable to determine which direction led to the beach. A steady wind blew him along with the current until he concluded that he was so lost there was little point in continuing to row in any particular destination. He set the oars back on the boat and huddled for warmth, allowing the boat to continue along whatever predetermined course it was on through this great sea of blackness. He closed his eyes to protect against a sudden gust, and when he opened them again, he could see no lights. He could hear no sounds. In every direction, all that existed was a white blanket of opaque fog, making it appear to the protagonist that he was inside of a large ping-pong ball. The sea had become unusually calm, with no waves or white caps to break up the darkness. He peered over the edge of the skiff into the water. It was just an unfathomable, bottomless blackness. Perhaps somewhere down in the depths was a fish or a rusted anchor, but there was no way to tell. From the surface, it seemed to be limitless darkness. He began to imagine that this was what nothingness was like, a sheer emptiness consisting of nothing except for impenetrable blackness. No lights, no sounds, no particles, no energy. With no external reference, it was impossible to even tell whether time itself was passing or not. He enjoyed a moment of quiet reflection and pondered the nature of eternity. But he soon realized it was one thing disrupting the purity of this vast emptiness: himself. He was a something. And since he was an observer intruding into the nothingness, the emptiness surrounding him, as empty as it was, could never be considered a true nothingness. A true nothingness would have to be completely invisible, as by definition no observer can ever be there to perceive the nothing without being a something to disrupt the nothing. If that was the case, then true nothingness is not defined as a zero, it is a question mark. Without an observer to check, it is not possible to ever say for sure what is inside the true nothing. And if it is impossible by definition to know what's inside of a true nothing, then wouldn't anything and everything be equally likely to be inside? Every combination of every possible object and every possible configuration was encompassed in the definition of question mark, wasn't it? True nothingness is not empty. It's actually a giant amorphous blob of everything, all at once. Until some outside observer looks in the box, it could be said to contain every possible thing, everything and everything and nothing, all at once. Perhaps this entire city was just a random manifestation of some unidentifiable amorphous blob inside a giant box no one happened to be looking into at the present time. And if that external entity, which existed outside the universe, opened the box and peered in, the question mark would collapse back into a zero, and the city would cease to exist. The protagonist was rocked as the skiff suddenly ran aground. He was thrown off his seat into the frigid water at the bottom of the boat. He arose to find himself and the boat lodged upon a rocky shore. It wasn't the same beach he had departed from, but at least it was dry land. He climbed out of the boat and dragged it up out of the tide where he left it. Then he scrambled up the riprap lining the shore and hopped over a small stone wall. He found himself in a small grove of trees, and pushing his way through the brambles and undergrowth, he emerged into a seemingly endless graveyard. There were a few lights to guide his way, and he soon found a path that might lead back to a gate leading to a city street. The tree-lined path meandered in a circuitous route past groves of tombstones. They rose from the ground in symmetrical patches, as if they were crops that were almost ready for harvest. A few gaudy monuments were scattered in between long, straight rows of modest, identical headstones. Some were muddied and overgrown with brown grass. Others showed signs of having been tidied at some point in the not-so-distant past. Dead flowers and decayed wreaths littered the ground. The roots of a large tree had evidently grown and half upturned a nearby gravestone, whose epitaph was partially obscured by moss. The upper section of the ancient and eroded stone had already cracked and fallen off. What remained was left teetering precariously, slanted at a 45-degree angle. Someday soon it would fall over completely. The protagonist felt a hint of sadness for the poor, unfortunate soul who was buried in this inopportune location. Was there anyone left alive in this city who even remembered the person who was interned here? He tried to read the stone, but the upper part, the part containing the name, was crumbled and lost. The only part that wasn't too weathered to make out clearly were the words, "Her suffering is mercifully concluded." He sat on a bench next to the tree and kept the tilting tombstone company for a moment. "Hello," he said to it. "I can't tell what your name is, so I'm just going to make one up." He did so, and found himself imagining other details about the interred person's life to fill the gaps. "Let's see. How did you end up in this sorry state? Looks like you were buried here, I'm going to guess 75 years ago? No, 100, he said, based on the eroded condition of the stone. I will assume you were married and had children, but then you lost your husband to the war and your children to a disease that would have been easily curable today. That's pretty tragic. I'm sorry to hear that." He tried to balance that thought out by imagining some happy days in her life, as a child blowing out candles on a birthday cake, as a teen sitting in warm summer parks making eyes at a special boy, a vision of rice thrown on a wedding day. But at the end it was just you, alone and forgotten as a dowager, surviving in a set of small cold rooms on a meager pension. He imagined that after she passed, her neighbors, who never bothered to know her while she still breathed, chipped in out of guilt to buy this small plot for her final rest. The protagonist knew that this tale was completely fictional, and it would only be coincidence if any part of it matched up with the deceased's actual life. but it was believable as any other version. As far as the protagonist knew, there might not even be anyone buried in this plot at all. He bent down and touched the soil with his hands. 6 feet underneath him was a box that can never be opened, filled with facts that can never be known, about a person he would never meet. The only way to be certain about anything related to this corpse was to travel back in time to when they still lived. But the current of time is one direction. It was impossible to peer inside that box. The person buried here was forever a question mark, and by definition, they were now just a superposition of anything and anyone and everything that they could have possibly been, all at the same time. There was no longer any functional difference between the actual person that had once lived and the infinite number of fictional versions of the person that any passerby cared to imagine. The protagonist extrapolated to note that this effect was observable even before death. As he walked the streets of the city earlier tonight, he passed by many strange faces that never interacted with him before, never would again. In their eyes, his entire past was a question mark. These anonymous strangers could make up any story about him, and it would be as true as any other, wouldn't it? It was impossible for anyone to know anything about the protagonist's childhood, whether he fought in a war or worked in a factory. By this particular time, these events were just stories, unverifiable. In that way, even though he still lived, the protagonist was as fictional as the person whose grave he currently sat in front of. The universe is just a set of lies we tell ourselves to feel like we matter. It began raining heavily, but the protagonist was already as wet as he could possibly get from his time in the boat, so he had little motivation to seek shelter. Soon, a rivulet of rainwater formed on the path. He watched as the water flowed from higher ground past his feet down the slight gradient and drained into a sewer gate. Individual leaves bobbed and floated, carried along by the current. On occasion, 2 leaves would bump into each other for a second, then separate to pursue their individual paths once again. They couldn't go back upstream. Their only interactions with each other were fleeting and pointless, and the end of their journeys were inevitable. The protagonist saw similarities between himself and the leaves. He wished he could hold on to someone and never let them go. He wished he could hold on to a moment and never let it slip by. He wished he could stop the relentless push that pressed him forward towards an inevitable future where everything increases in entropy, decaying, withering, falling apart. But like the leaves, he was being involuntarily pulled through time by an inescapable force. What was the nature of that force? Was God, the singularity at the end of time, inexorably pulling us towards its domain in the far future? Or was it something as farcical as a cosmic sewer grate? There was no way to know until you finally arrived at the end of time, and by that point it was too late. He looked up and noticed that beyond the tree, some distance off the path, a lone lamppost illuminated a small section of the graveyard. The protagonist found himself drawn through the rows of stones towards the light. He stumbled over unseen obstacles in the dark underbrush and stubbed a toe more than once, but he arrived at the lamppost that had beckoned to him. Beneath the light were a number of fresher graves, so fresh in fact that the stones hadn't been carved yet. They were totally blank. There seemed a certain familiarity to them, but he couldn't quite recall how he knew them. It was really impossible to be sure of anything about any of the people interred in this grove. The protagonist had a disturbing thought. If anyone could be buried here, then maybe the grave he was standing on was his own. He realized that didn't make sense, as he was clearly here on the surface. But the infinite set of things included in the question mark would encompass both the set of everything that made sense and the set of everything that didn't. In some uncollapsed part of the probability wave function, he was the corpse buried under his feet. And not just this one grave, but all these graves. Not just in this grove, but throughout the entire cemetery. not just in this cemetery, but all cemeteries, everywhere in the universe. His eyes scanned row after row of tombstones, stretching as far as his eye could see, each one containing himself, or some probabilistic version of himself, that had made slightly different sets of choices in life that resulted in a different collapse of the probability wave function. 1,000 alternate paths, 1,000 tragic accidents, 1,000 gruesome diseases, 1,000 lonely suicides. All paths as equally true, as equally fictional as the one that led him to be standing here, lost and alone in the rain. In the distance, a flash of lightning crossed the sky, and the lamp above him flickered momentarily due to some disruption in the power line. In that brief instance, probably due to some trick of the light, the protagonist glimpsed names etched across the stones in the grove, and they were his own. He backed away from the stone he was standing in front of in terror, unsettled at the idea of standing upon his own grave. He turned and ran, and almost immediately felt himself tumbling through space. He had a vision of himself leaping from a balcony and hurtling past windows and awnings onto the sidewalk below. As he lay crushed and deflated on the ground, he could see the feet of a couple with better places to be gingerly walking past. He had a vision of himself alone and tortured in a dark and unheated room. Only a flickering candle provides him with enough light to load the pistol. He had a vision of himself touring a factory's production floor. A large machine violently stamps metal in front of him. He fidgets with his necktie and imagines what would happen should it get caught in the gears. The idea delights him more than he expected it would. He had a vision of himself swinging from a rope tied about his neck, wishing he had jumped from a slightly greater height to save himself the suffering of strangulation. He had a vision of himself lying on pavement, too dope-sick to sit up, as lines of fashionable young men and women filed past, incapable of even noticing his suffering. He had a vision of himself crossing a horrific no-man's land, rifle in hand and human war cries screaming from his lips, then suddenly flying through the air, ripped to pieces from a volley of grape shot. He had a vision of not being able to breathe, everything fading to black as the cries of helpless restaurant patrons filled his ears. He had a vision of extreme hopelessness and nihilism as he swirled and sank deeper and deeper through dark and frigid water. His last thought was a hope that the zero would revert to a question mark on account of his no longer being an observer to this universe. No one would ever know of his sacrifice. He awoke to a throbbing pain in the back of his head. He slowly opened his eyes and found himself lying in the mud at the bottom of a deep hole. He remained motionless for a few moments, calmly watching the light from the nearby lamppost reflect in the raindrops as they fell down upon him, and he despaired. He felt his body fading into something as anonymous and fictional as the rest of the poor souls interred in this dreadful place. He could think of no proof that any of the events of his life had even happened at all. Perhaps it was all just a delusion. Was he actually here, at the bottom of this open grave? Or was he simply a random collection of atoms somewhere in the cosmos that spontaneously came together in a pattern that, for an instant, mimicked a self-aware brain, one replete with delusions of a past that never happened? A statistical fluctuation that remained intact just long enough to have a single coherent thought or observation, only then to disappear into the vacuum as suddenly as it appeared. Finding himself at such a low point, no past to cling to, no future to look forward to, now lost down an oubliette, he descended into a solitude so frightful that he contemplated suicide. What held him back was the idea that no one, absolutely no one, would be moved by his death, that he would be even more alone in death than in life. Suicide is a confession that the state of being dead is somehow more meaningful than the state of being alive. Yet, the pointlessness and absurdity of life could not be solved by death, which is itself an equally pointless and absurd state of being. There was no functional difference between the two. Existence being just a game we were all forced to play against our will. A game we can't win, we can't tie, and we can't even decline to play. The protagonist reached the conclusion that while life was not worth living, death was also not worth dying, and the meaninglessness of existence could not be the determining factor in how one must proceed. The past was by definition unobservable, forever beyond reach, and the future existed as nothing more than an uncollapsed probability of all that might possibly happen. Neither had any bearing on the fleeting moment in time known as now. Any action one might take in any particular instant was as equally valid as any other. No right or wrong choices existed. No mistakes could be made because the test would forever remain ungraded. The protagonist felt a great weight lift off of him. He sat up and rubbed his head with his hand. The back of his hair was sticky with blood from the rock he had fallen upon. The pit he had fallen into was 6 feet deep, with squared-off walls. He rose to his feet and clawed his way back to the surface. With a dirty finger, he wrote his name on the blank tombstone above the open hole. He brushed the muck off his overcoat as best he could and found his pocket filled with dirt. He withdrew a handful and tossed it into his grave, and then continued on his way. He returned to the tilting tombstone he had visited earlier and knelt beside it. "No," the protagonist whispered to it. "I retract that entire story about your life. I couldn't help you with any of your troubles while you walked this earth, but I can overwrite them now." He made up a story in his mind about the person below him, a wonderful story about a wonderful life filled with excitement and joy and meaning. The words, "Her suffering is mercifully concluded," on the tombstone were a final ironic joke made by her loved ones. "You hear that?" he shouted to the heavens. "That is this person's true life story." He took the heavens' silence as acquiescence. Feeling good about himself for his noble act, the protagonist turned to his own past and imagined himself a happy childhood filled with love and a life replete with meaning and without trauma. Whatever truth he'd lived before today, it was forevermore unreachable, a question mark, and so it could be filled with anything. Why should he continue to suffer in the present for trauma from an unobservable and inherently fungible past? He arrived at a crossroads in the meandering cemetery path near an elaborate gravestone marked with the name Kerr. A large puddle had formed there due to a clogged drain. The protagonist kicked some debris free, and the water began to flow again. He watched the current and observed that the water didn't flow directly into the sewer in a straight line, but instead swirled around it in a whirlpool. Leaves floating in the puddle circled around faster and faster as they were drawn into the vortex. What if time isn't like a river, the protagonist thought to himself, but like a whirlpool? In a river, everything upstream is forevermore out of reach, but the same isn't true of a whirlpool. While it is true that you could never go counterclockwise against the current, if you wait patiently, the clockwise rotation would inevitably return you to the same place you once had been, over and over again. Could it be that falling far enough into the future brings you back to the past? Maybe, if he waited patiently, the inescapable current of time would complete a rotation and return him to where he'd been before. Each revolution tracing the same path again and again, each revolution falling a little farther down towards the center, each circuit a slight bit more compact. And with each rotation, each floating leaf grows closer to the other leaves also caught in the vortex. Each revolution bringing him a little closer to the God that was the singularity that existed at the end of time. Maybe the next cycle would be different. Maybe he wouldn't be so alone. Maybe he would finally be able to grab onto some person, some hope, some meaning, some tribe, as it crossed paths with him in the tightening gyre. And if not in this revolution, maybe in the next, or the next after that, or the next after that. He would have to find something to occupy himself with in the meantime, while he waited to complete his circuit around the vortex. He reached the front gate of the cemetery and exited back onto the streets of the city. The sidewalk in front of him was stained dark with water. Small droplets on his glasses turned the street lights into astigmatic pinwheels in his eyes. He walked at random, calm and empty, under a wasted sky.